morning in Chennai. It was Pongal. Pongal for you, I think it's early January. And 1995 was the time. I've gone there to meet my would-be wife and meet her parents. We got down to talking, and while serving tea, my mother-in-law asked me, how will my daughter live in Surat city? I heard it's a very dirty city, and she has lived all her life in places like Hyderabad and Chennai, and this question made me feel bad. I have lived in that city for 5 years at that time, and I was wondering, what do I tell her? What do I actually say? There has been some change in the place. Somehow I mumbled something and got away at that time, and I moved on. And later on, luckily my wife decided to get married to me. And we landed in Surat after the marriage. And the first question she asked me as we got off the train is, where are the garbage? Where is the garbage? I thought there will be heaps of garbage everywhere in the city. And I smiled. And my mind raced back to 4 months to what happened to this great city. This was September 1994. I think it was 9th or 10th of September. And I was in the city, and I was working in my company as a HR professional at that time. And one day early morning, there was a murmur, there was a big conversation that a real pandemic has hit the city. And it was supposed to be a pneumonic plague. And believe me, and within 4 hours or 5 hours, almost half the city ran away. Half the city left of 7 lakh people. Nobody was left behind in the city, and the city was empty. And after a few days, after the initial pandemic of this plague has subsided, people have started returning, and that is when we heard horror stories. A daughter who went to her parents' place in some other town was not allowed to come inside. A group of people who went to a nearby city were not allowed to go into a hotel because they were coming in from Surat, and they had to stay in the car for the next 2 days. And there were many, many such stories which were actually told, and the city was experiencing a collective shame. And there was no going back from that particular time. And what happened then from September 1994 is the story of this great city. And this breakthrough and transformation of everything that you can imagine of, the kind of sacrifices people have made to let go personal property so that the roads can be made, the kind of large-scale citizen partnership in terms of doing things, the kind of public investment that could be seen. For your information, Surat is one of the richest cities, and people used to make tons of money, but somehow the devil-may-care attitude, which was evident earlier, I think suddenly it was called to question. And that is when a catalyst comes in the form of the new municipal commissioner, and stories have been written after that. How the city subsequently made those kind of changes, and it continued to transform and made that kind of a breakthrough, and it made me think. It made me think as a student, and I've been part of that particular encounter very closely at that time. And luckily I stayed back in the city during that period. I was distributing medicines. And somebody said tetracycline needs to be given to people if you have to protect yourself from plague. And then you have to wear socks and put your feet 4 feet up if you have to be not to be bitten by the rats. So that was the kind of medication that was taught. And then people were doing that for the next 8 days or 10 days before somebody said it is all over. And the student in me asked the question, what is this that led to all these kinds of changes? The most important thing that I realized as a coach and as a human resource professional and as a people professional was that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And when the student is taught, the lessons are learned for life. And that's exactly what happened to this great city. And it set me thinking. Many of you would be wondering, the same thing happened to Japan, same thing happened to Germany, same thing happened to many great places. When they were destroyed, how did they actually rise up from those kind of ashes and build themselves? But another question was bugging me. Do these things sustain? Many of us know of breakthroughs, whether the breakthroughs sustain, whether the cities and the citizens can live up to a life which is beyond and actually continue on the journey. And that is where I think my second question was answered. And that was, when citizens get used to higher levels of opportunity and base of living, a quality of life, they do not want to go back. And they start expecting from all the authorities what is the kind of a learning that they had during that particular kind of a period. And the city which you see now, and I'm very proud to be standing in this city, which is the cleanest city, and then this city has almost come very close to be called as the cleanest city in various surveys in the country. And I was so proud that whenever I talk about Surat, I see the transformation of the city, and I see breakthroughs, and I see catalysts playing a very important role within that particular kind of story. But student in me kept bugging me. And I kept asking, while organizations, I think I've seen plenty of breakthroughs where we talk about innovation, how you create a culture of innovation, and how do you teams make innovation in large projects and so on and so forth. But I think what was more interesting to me was how do individuals with limited means, what is the kind of breakthroughs and what is the kind of journeys they make. I heard my wife, who is an anthroposophic psychotherapist, telling me that all of us are born with a unique purpose. But some of us lose our way. Sometimes a critical illness or a tragedy can actually set you back on the right path. And that made me think even deeper and then start looking at what are the kind of stories which actually support this kind of a thought. And then I went through the various stories that have been built about the Padma Shri Award winners of 2020. There were stories which we talk about. There was a guy called Langar Baba, supposed to be feeding 2,000 people in a hospital in Chandigarh with his own money for the last 20 years. There was a lady by the name Tulsi Gowda. She has personally planted 30,000 trees and she's called the mother of the forest. And there's a gentleman by the name Satya Narayan who has given up a cushy government job and promote education in Arunachal Pradesh. And interestingly, these two stories really stuck in my head. This is about Sharif Chacha, who's a bicycle mechanic who has done final cremation rites for 25,000 people with his own money in Ayodhya and Faizapur district, and not looking for any help or recognition. And what has happened, what has driven him towards that particular kind of a path or a journey. This is Javed Tak, a Kashmiri who was shot by the terrorists and who has been paralyzed for the life, and how he actually overcame the self-pity he was wallowing in for 2 years and turned his attention to turn and bring about a school for disabled children near his house in Kashmir, and then how he has made this happen. Both these stories made me believe that sometimes tragedy strikes, sometimes an illness strikes, and in his case very interesting. When I read through his interview and I found out that his 2 sons died as orphans and they were cremated as orphans in some other city. And then he chose to pursue something of this particular kind, and then made me believe that there are many such people who have chosen a path wherein the breakthrough has come because of a personal tragedy or an illness, and then they have chosen a path and discovered a life which will take them on a different direction. And they chose not to be just a noun but an action verb in their lives. And I wanted to go closer home. He said, well, I look at cities, I look at countries, I look at actually people who have achieved great things. What about us, the average human beings like all of us at home, in classes, in schools? What are the kind of options we have with respect to that? The first thing is that a very interesting story goes back to my daughter who was in the 10th standard, one day telling me, Dad, I had experienced a serious meltdown when I discovered that how little am I achieving and I'm doing in comparison to my peers. While I have fewer classes, but they seem to do so much more and they're achieving a lot more. And how are they able to do that? And I experienced and I cried and cried and cried, and I discovered that one day I just got out of it myself and then walked out, and through self-regulation and self-taught, she healed herself. So it taught me a very important lesson that we are all capable of healing ourselves. We don't need too much of external help. By actually self-regulation and self-talk, I think you can bring about a kind of a change. On the other hand, very interestingly, my wife, she set out to do a school for disabled children. And because of the expectations of the parent, she could not cope with the same and she had to give up that particular school. And then she took external help of a coach, and then she turned around and then built a flourishing radio shows and books and author, and she has become a counselor of great repute with respect to that. So I realized that failures and bouncing back is another very, very important thing what you need to be doing about that. These stories nearer home had made me believe that there is something which we can all tap within ourselves, bounce back, and heal ourselves in a significant fashion. There's another very small story which one of my friends, very close friends of mine, which I'm sure will really reflect for each one of you, he used to fail regularly in the class. Up to the 9th standard, he was regularly failing, and then the master told him that unless you pass, you will not be allowed to sit for the exams next. And mind you, he turned around and then actually not only passed the exams, cleared NDA, became a pilot, became actually an aviation captain, and he reached and grew out of the phoenix like an ashes of the fire. And it's so interesting to know that I think this is fear of the consequences, and fear of failure also can push us through that particular gap and make sure that we can achieve that kind of a breakthrough. All these at a national level or at a city level or at the great achievements made by the people level or closer home, all these things have taught me a very interesting thing. A breakthrough can be as simple as a workaround, overcoming a self-limiting belief, or in terms of just change of mindset and making sure that we take a path which was different from what we have been doing earlier. But interestingly, I also surmise that when these things happen only when you are ready for that particular change. That means the time is ripe and you're ready for the change happens with respect to that particular kind of story. And last but not the least, you realize that who can support us? Like any new birth, you require a midwife. There is a need of support even when you have to do a breakthrough, and the support can come in the form of a coach, or it can come in the form of your support to parents, spouse, or your own self-reflection, as many of my colleagues talked about, and the journaling that you can do to look back and then look ahead and then build the kind of a life you want to lead. All these have made me to believe that there is only one important thing, gentlemen, ladies, and others. Most important thing is, I think what you need to do is there are opportunities and breakthroughs waiting to happen. Be open and be alert. All significant breakthroughs or break with old ways of thinking. It is nothing to do with actually significantly achieving greater and greater things, but the smallest of the small things what you can do is the breaking away from the old mindsets and old ways of doing things. Thank you very much.